Need your daily fix on mixed martial arts?
We're going to kind of recap Bellator 155.
From UFC 198.
Who's who?
Kind of a controversial decision.
And who's not?
I couldn't figure out why, and then it hit me.
Well, don't you fret, because Golden State Media Concepts got you covered. Get your daily dose of MMA podcast. Everything from the UFC, Bellator Fighting Championships, Extreme Cage Fighting, Invicta Fighting Championships, and so much more. Join us as we talk about some of the biggest names in mixed martial arts. We've got you covered here on Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC MMA Podcast. I am your host, Tate, and today we are talking about UFC 243, which is start out as, when you look at the card, it didn't seem that exciting, but let me tell you, it was an exciting card. Capped off with a pretty sweet dance move into Israel Adesanya being the undisputed middleweight champion as he takes out Robert Whittaker. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about Darren Hooker, and then we're going to also talk about other news and notes that are going on in the mixed martial arts world. So when you look at this event, which was a record-breaking crowd in Melbourne, Australia, it broke the previous record, which was UFC 193, which had 56,214 people. That was Ronda Rousey versus Holly Holm. And I personally thought this event here at UFC 243, which ended up breaking the record and having 57,127, it mirrored each other, very similar. And what I mean by that is the fact that when I first started looking at this fight, and I looked at Israel versus Whittaker, and I thought about Gaslam when Israel fought Gaslam, and I'm thinking, Whittaker's going to have, it's a much taller fighter, could apply a lot more pressure. This is going to be a tough time for Israel. And I thought that the pressure would be too much. The event, Whittaker has been to major events like this. I looked at things, I'm like, okay, the wrestling, Whittaker. The toughness, Whittaker. I did think Israel was going to be flashy. I thought his reach and his range would be a big factor in this event. And so when I first started looking at this, I'm thinking, I got Whittaker to win this, possibly by decision or late round stoppage. But as I started watching things and I looked at the press conference leading up to it, and Israel was super relaxed, and I looked at the face-off, and Israel was cool, just a cool customer. And I watched Whittaker, and Whittaker was the one that was looking tense and just not his normal self. And then the walkout happened, which we'll talk about that walkout in a second. But the walkout came out, and no, we'll talk about it now. Israel comes out with his buddies, his lifelong childhood friends, and they put on a quite impressive dance move, and which is something that's not normally done in the UFC. And I love that fact that the UFC and Dana White allowed him to put on some type of show. That's one of the things that I feel like the UFC is missing the boat on when you look at events like Bellator and One Championship, who puts on quite a spectacular production for their fighters. And the fighters love it. So, but when I watched Israel and he does his dance and then he walks to the ring and he is super, super relaxed. Like, this is just going to be another sparring session. And then I watched Robert Whittaker come to the ring and he is super tense and tight. And I turn to my wife and I say, I changed my mind. I'm taking Israel. And the reason why, and I even said this reminds me of the Ronda Rousey Holly Holm fight, which was in the exact same arena, just years ago, which was the previous record. And with that fight, with the Holly Holm Ronda Rousey fight, the whole way leading up to it, I was thinking Ronda was going to win. Ronda was going to she would come off of blowing out Kat Zingano, destroying Bethe Correia, and then she rolls into Holly Holm. And Ronda was very different. She was very tense. And Holly was just very sweet and relaxed. And Ronda was kind of out of was not her normal self. And I said, I changed my mind. I'm taking Holly to win that fight. And I was right. And then this weekend, the same feeling in the exact same arena gave me that same feeling. It just felt like Whittaker had a lot of pressure on him. And a lot of times, I've said this a lot of times when it comes to fighting in your hometown. I never like a fighter going home to fight in his hometown. It was very obvious to me that Whittaker, who had been off for an extended period of time, he was fighting in his home country. He really wanted to put on a show. And he was really amped up for it. But when a fighter comes in a little too amped up, you tend to be a little tighter, which then allows you not to be able to flow as well. And it also makes you susceptible to getting caught. And once the fight started, you could tell in the first round, they were quite evenly matched up initially, but it was obvious that Israel, like I said, was using a lot of movement and was quite calm and relaxed in there. And Whittaker, he was going on big spurts where he would throw. He wasn't being efficient in the ring. He was throwing hard shots and was missing, and he kept missing. And they were both kind of landing both ways, but Israel showed that when he did get caught, he could handle Whittaker's power. But at the end of that round, it started to look a little different. That Israel was trying to time Whittaker and counter. He was trying to use his footwork and to be able to counter Whittaker. And that's exactly what happened. Right at the end of the round, he catches Whittaker, and he catches Whittaker hard. When Whittaker drops, if there's another minute, that fight doesn't make it out of the first round. It just didn't seem like Whittaker could come back from that shot. But it was at the very end of the round, and Whittaker was able to get himself back together. And by the time round 2 had started, it felt like Whittaker was back being himself. But he was still intense. He was still trying to throw incredibly hard it kind of felt like he was he was looking for like a home run shot. And instead of taking his time and letting the home run shot come to him, this was the first time that I saw him that he was trying. It was like he was trying too hard, and Israel was just landing major counter shots, using his footwork, using his movement, and his movement was a major factor because Israel kept being able to bend or move back or lean just enough to be out of the range, but still be able to fire a shot. And so when he caught Whittaker, I think personally, because of the fact that he was so tight and tense, would get dropped. And when he got finished off, it was one of those situations where I think in a rematch, I think Whittaker would fare a lot better. This was just not his night. And something that a lot of us has already known, but the UFC has a star on his hands. Israel, he can fight. He has that showmanship. He has the moves. He knows how to put a production on, can handle a press conference, put a show on before the fight, put a show on in the ring, and then come out and put on another show. And he also, for those of you who are Anderson Silva fans, he reminds me so much of Anderson Silva. And the question I have is, can he go on a run like Anderson Silva? That is something that's unprecedented. But he reminds me so much of Anderson Silva. And then afterwards, as he's in the ring, and one of the first things he does is he calls out Paulo Costa, and he's not waiting on Dana White or someone to say, oh, this is going to be your next opponent. He made sure to make his next opponent the baddest, toughest man in the division. And I had a lot of respect for that, because that made it, instantly Apollo might not have been the perfect person as far as a drawing card goes, but when you look around and with an event like this, and then you have the interaction, now there is a reason for that event. They hyped that event up in the ring before it can ever be made. Now, there's a lot of casual fans who might have watched this event that's going to be very curious about seeing this and going to want to see this fight. And so I find it very fascinating. It was, as a whole, when you look at this event, I thought a fantastic event. And like I said, we got a new champ, we got a new star. And when you look around and you look at the UFC, and like I'll talk about like TJ Dillashaw. He comes out and he says the UFC and the bantamweight division, they need him. Well, the UFC is showing that they don't really need anyone. As one star, as Anderson leaves, a new star comes. As McGregor goes down, now you have, Diaz and Masvidal. As George St. Pierre leaves, the UFC has shown that no fighter is bigger than the brand. it's becoming like the NFL, because as these big name fighters leave, Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate, there's a new group, a new crop of stars that keep coming in. You know, you got Usman, you got Israel, you got Jorge Masvidal now, as it just keeps growing. And Israel is definitely one of those guys that are definitely going to move the needle. Now, when you start thinking about what's next for Israel, Paulo Costa is the one that everyone has been talking about. You have Yoel Romero, who sent a message and said, "I'll see you soon." That would be a really interesting fight, Yoel versus Israel. There is a lot of, let's say, the start of bad blood between Jon Jones and Israel. Now, be careful what you wish for. Dana White has said that would be an interesting fight. That would be a big fight. And I don't want to see the UFC make the mistake of chasing dollars over protecting their fighters. Because you could easily have a situation where you could put Israel in the ring with Jon Jones too soon. If that Israel-Jon Jones fight happened, I'm going to take Jon Jones every day. Jon Jones is just too big, too long, too strong. But I do like Israel over Paulo, and I would love to see that Yoel Romero-Israel fight. I personally think those are the two fights that are most attractive for Israel. Now, Robert Whittaker. He talks about how, you know, he's young and he will be back. And I do believe that he will be back. But it's no guarantee that he will be champ again. And he had a very surprising rise to the championship. But when you look at this division now, it's stronger than it has been maybe ever. You have a jam-packed division with a lot of fighters that are easily could be champ. So it is no guarantee that Robert Whittaker would be back. But if you ask me what's next for Robert Whittaker, I would love to see him, let's say, fight. I don't know if a third fight with Yoel Romero would be great, but Kevin Gastelum would be a great fight that I would like to see. There's a number of fights that he can have, but as far as an immediate rematch, I just, because of the way he was stopped, I just don't see an immediate rematch coming back. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Iaquinta versus Dan Hooker fight, and then we're going to cover some other news around the UFC. Stay tuned, and we will be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, we're back, and we just got done talking about the UFC 243 main event and about Israel Adesanya being the new middleweight champion. Even though he walked around with two belts, one was the interim championship and one is the official title. He's not a champ. He's just the middleweight champ, and he deserves it. Now, talking about someone deserving something, boy, Dan Hooker deserved that win. He put on a clinic against Iaquinta. Going into this, I was taking Iaquinta to win. I thought too much experience, too much pressure. It would be, I thought, a really great fight, but I really thought Al would just be too much for him. I thought he would just apply too much pressure, too much. I was really wrong on this one. I did not see this fight going this way. And I'm going to tell you this. Dan Hooker just put on a perfect show. It was kind of like watching if an instructor was teaching a class on striking, movement, fighting from a distance, leg kicks. He pretty much had his way with Iaquinta. When I look at this fight and I'm looking at my notes, and my note just says Dan is landing leg shots at ease. And then on the ground and pound, big elbows were landed in the first round. It really was a clinic. Then you moved on to the second round when Dan dropped Al with a right hand. And throughout the rest of the fight, he was able to use his footwork, use his range, and leg kicks, in which Al had really no real answer. It was an impressive showing. And then the thing that I thought was so impressive is the fact that Israel and Dan have the same trainers in the same camp, and he did not want to hold up his trainers from getting to Israel. So he went in. After the fight, they went for his interview, in-ring interview, and he just made it short and sweet. He's like, I want Dustin Poirier next, and just ran out of the ring. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. But then I realized the whole situation about the fact that Israel was sitting in the back by himself, waiting to come out. No trainers, no coaches, no one to really warm him up, because they were all at the ring with Dan Hooker. So it was really cool that he kept that in mind on this big giant stage, but he was still able to keep that in mind, not steal the spotlight, and get out of there so that they could get back there to Israel to get him ready for his fight. Now, he called out Dustin Poirier. Later on, he talked about Justin Gaethje. Dustin Poirier just flat out just said, not interested. Dustin Poirier believes he's going to get Conor McGregor next, and there is absolute no interest on his side to fight Dan Hooker, and I don't blame him. Dan Hooker is a dangerous guy, and when you're looking at a possible Conor McGregor fight, which means millions upon millions, or you can fight Dan Hooker for thousands upon thousands. It's just that simple. I don't blame him for saying no to the fight. But Dan Hooker has established himself as one of the top fighters in the division. And as he keeps winning, you're not going to be able to avoid him for long. So that is I just wanted to do a quick take on that one. And we're going to talk about some of the other fights around, on this card that kind of caught my eye. Douglas Lima put on an incredible show. And I'm sorry, Diego Lima, not Douglas. That's his brother. Sorry about that. But he put on an incredible show. In my opinion, won that fight from bell to bell. This is my opinion, but I didn't think there was ever a round that was even close. It was an easy decision. No offense to Luke, but when the scorecards came in and it was a split decision, I was absolutely stunned. One judge gave that fight to Luke, and I was stunned. And sometimes you look at some of the judging and some of the scoring, and it's like, how is it possible that a judge could give that fight? I understand giving a round. There was one close round. I gave all three. I gave it a 30-27 fight. But when you look at the final scores, one judge had it 29-28. Another judge had it 29-28. So both judges gave Lima that he lost one round. But the other judge had it 28-29. Unless that was a mistake, how is it possible? I thought it took away from his win. And it was just disappointing. But it was a good show. It was I'm not gonna say a great show, but it was definitely an entertaining fight to watch. A knockout on this card that was quite impressive was Yorgan De Castro. He caught Justin Tafa with an incredible shot, and Tafa was gone. I mean, he was asleep. And man, this guy, he definitely has heavyweight power. Right now, I don't see him with heavyweight skills, but he definitely has heavyweight power. And it was definitely on display that night. Another fight on this card that I was impressed with was Megan Anderson. Megan Anderson came in. She was coming off of a big loss, and she reestablished herself in the division again as someone or a true threat for the title. She won with a triangle choke. She looked impressive. First round stoppage. Those are the fights that really caught my eye. Now, over the weekend, another thing that caught my eye, I do not traditionally watch WWE. I used to watch WWE all the time. I was a big time WWE fan. But in recent years, I've just pretty much stopped watching WWE. So I don't know what made me turn on the TV and watch WWE. I mean, there was no reason for me to do it. But for some reason, I sat down and I watched the entire card. And at the very end, Brock Lesnar's in the ring, and he beats Kofi Kingston in no time flat. I'm like, that had to be a record. And then the big surprise came out. You hear Rey Mysterio's music. That kind of shows you, that I used to watch wrestling because I definitely know all the guys. But you hear Rey Mysterio's music, and they showed a little bit about how Brock had beat up Rey Mysterio and Rey Mysterio's son. And I'm like, okay, here we go. They're setting up for Brock Lesnar versus Rey Mysterio. Rey Mysterio's son's going to get involved. This is going to be the launch of Rey Mysterio's son's career, things like that. But it wasn't a launch for Rey Mysterio's career, son's career. It was the launch of Cain Velasquez as a WWE wrestler, and I was shocked. I knew that Cain wanted to be a wrestler. I knew that he was in talks with possibly being joining the WWE. I know he worked out with the WWE a couple times. But to see him in the ring and they're angling it as Cain Velasquez, the man who took Brock Lesnar's UFC title, it was an interesting turn, it definitely caught my eye. It was weird seeing Cain in the ring. I don't know how well I can see Cain Velasquez actually selling a fight. He doesn't really have that personality. But I didn't think Ronda Rousey could sell it. And Ronda Rousey sold it in spades. And then the fact that Cain Velasquez has also withdrawn from the USADA testing pool, that also tells me that he's 100% in on the whole wrestling thing, because I'm not gonna make accusations, but if you're trying to get in shape to be a WWE wrestler, there's a lot more supplements that you can use as a WWE wrestler than you can as a UFC fighter. And so it is official that he intends to withdraw from the UFC, the USADA testing pool, and he has thrown his hat in the ring to be a wrestler and wrestle Brock Lesnar, and that I find fascinating. Now, what else do I find fascinating that's going on in the news? Bellator announced that on December 29th, they are going to be teaming up with Rizin. So Bellator and Rizin are actually going to do an event, a co-promoted event in Japan, in which Fedor is going to be at the top of the card, and it looks like it's going to be Fedor's last fight ever, and it's going to be a co-event in which Fedor will main event the first ever, as far as I know, first ever Bellator Rizin event. I got to give it to Scott Coker. He is willing to do whatever it takes to promote his brand, and I think he's doing a good job. I'm not always the biggest viewer of Bellator, but the Grand Prix that he put on, I really thought were quite ingenious, and I love this whole concept of Bellator versus Rizin. I only got one request. There was an article out there that Antonio Bigfoot Silva is throwing his name in the ring as an opponent for Fedor. Yes, both fighters are older, both fighters are past their prime, but Bigfoot Silva, I really just feel like Bigfoot Silva should not be fighting any longer. I feel like it's dangerous. I don't like it. And I definitely would not tune in to see Fedor fight Bigfoot Silva. So that is definitely not a fight I am interested in. Now, a fight that a couple fights that I would be interested in. There was an interview with Khabib's father And Khabib's father was talking about the possibility of a Conor McGregor Khabib rematch in Moscow. And the father said he would definitely be open to a Conor McGregor Khabib Nurmagomedov fight in Moscow, and that would be blockbuster. Putting these two guys together in Moscow would just the whole concept. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus the notorious one, Conor McGregor, Moscow, just sounds just too sweet. It's a must see. Another fight that was brought up was Dana White. Dana White was asked about this, about a Khabib versus George St. Pierre fight. And he said that would be a fun fight to make after the Tony Ferguson fight. So, the only fight that I could see that would railroad a Conor McGregor versus Khabib fight would be a George St. Pierre fight. That would be a bigger fight, or a fight that I would want to see over any fight. So we all know that Tony Ferguson, we've been bitten a few times. This fight hasn't gone through, but it is now the time for Tony Ferguson versus Khabib. And this is not, Khabib versus Tony Ferguson is not a foregone conclusion that he's going to blow out Tony Ferguson. Ferguson provides some very interesting challenges that no one else has ever put toward Khabib. And so I still want to see that fight. I've been dying to see that fight. And then a possible, after that, a GSP or Conor McGregor fight. After that, Khabib has a situation where he runs off 3 fights that would be just major money. You go from Tony Ferguson to George St. Pierre and then roll right into a Conor McGregor fight. That's more money, more money, more money. It's just, you can't get a better 3 fight dance card than that. Speaking of future fights and people talking about fights that could happen in the future. This week, Chris Ryman has a fight coming up. He's fighting in Boston. But Chris isn't talking about Dominic Reyes, who he has a fight with. He is talking about the fact that if he dominates Reyes, he thinks that he would be able to jump the line of everyone in the light heavyweight division and go right to John Jones. And I think he's right. When you start looking around and you say, what fight do you want to see in the light heavyweight division? And you start thinking about the different contenders in the division. I'm sorry, John Jones has cleaned that division out. So if that division is already cleaned out and there's not really a big enough name, a big enough star that would draw the audience, a Chris Weidman versus John Bones Jones fight would be the biggest fight you could make other than a Daniel Cormier fight. Do you want to see, let's say, Gustafsson again? Maybe Rumble Johnson, but Rumble's out. He's talking about making a comeback. Gustafsson's talking about making a comeback. They're both keeping the door open. Gustafsson says anything can happen. Rumble kind of made it pretty much official, but he's going to come back as a heavyweight. not as a light heavyweight. So when you start looking around at what's next for Jon Jones as far as making money and making headlines, the Chris Weidman fight is the most attractive fight out there. Daniel Cormier said, Stipe is his last fight, win, lose, or draw. If the Stipe fight doesn't go off, he's not going to have the Jon Jones trilogy. I don't believe him, because I think if Cormier fights, and let's say he starches Stipe, then do you set up for a fourth fight between those guys, or do you roll into a Jon Jones Cormier fight at heavyweight? I think that fight will happen. I do not believe that Cormier will retire without one more opportunity at Jon Jones. Just looking at that as a possibility. This concludes our episode of the UFC 243. You're listening to the GSMC MMA podcast. Please remember to subscribe. And also, I'd always ask you to write a review. The reviews really help and really help us get more shows on the air. So please subscribe, follow, and review. Give us a 5-star review. It definitely helps out the show and it keeps us around. With that, to all, have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.